On the evening of September 14, 1847, in a modest boarding house on Boston's Beacon Hill, a woman who had spent 23 years as a slave did something that should have been impossible. When a white man, an attorney from Virginia with the power to send her back into bondage, asked her a direct question and demanded to see her freedom papers, she looked him in the eyes and said a single word: no. It was the first time in her life she had ever refused a white man's direct command. That one word would set in motion a chain of events that would expose a forgery network reaching into Boston's highest social circles, lead to the arrest of one of the city's wealthiest merchants, and force her to confront a terrifying question. Was freedom in the North worth the price she'd have to pay to keep it? Her name was Margaret Thornhill, and what happened in the days after her refusal would test everything she thought she knew about courage, loyalty, and survival. Before we discover what really happened when Margaret said that word, that dangerous, revolutionary word, I want to ask you something. This channel exists to bring you the hidden stories of American history, the moments of resistance and courage that never made it into the textbooks. If you're listening right now, you're part of a community that refuses to let these stories disappear. Subscribe to the channel, hit that notification bell, and leave a comment telling me what state or city you're listening from. Now let's go back to September 1847 and discover what gave Margaret Thornhill the strength to say no. The story begins not in Boston, but 300 miles south, in a place Margaret spent years trying to forget. Margaret Thornhill wasn't born with that name. She was born Sarah, no last name, on the Hartwick plantation in Nottoway County, Virginia, in 1823. The Hartwick family grew tobacco, and like most planters in the Virginia Piedmont, they'd begun selling their excess slaves south to the cotton boom after the soil gave out. By 1846, the Hartwick plantation was dying, slowly but unmistakably. The main house needed repairs no one could afford. The tobacco barns leaned at dangerous angles, and the enslaved population, once numbering over 60, had dwindled to 18. Margaret worked in the main house as a seamstress. She had quick fingers and sharp eyes, useful qualities for mending the family's increasingly threadbare clothing. She was considered trustworthy, a word that in that context meant she'd learned to make herself invisible, to anticipate needs before they were spoken, to never ever contradict or question. She had perfected the art of survival through absolute submission. Her husband Peter was not so fortunate. He worked in the fields, and in the summer of 1846, Isaac Hartwick, the plantation owner's eldest son, decided Peter would bring a good price in the New Orleans market. The family needed cash. Peter was young, strong, and worth approximately $200. The sale was arranged for September. On August 23, 1846, Peter disappeared. 3 days later, Margaret followed. The Underground Railroad through Virginia was a network of whispers and shadows, of trusted hands guiding you from one hiding place to the next. Margaret knew none of the names of the people who helped her. She was told not to ask. She spent 9 days in the crawl space beneath a Quaker family's kitchen near Richmond, 11 days in a false-bottomed wagon carrying flour barrels through Maryland, and 4 terrifying days hidden in the hold of a fishing vessel that carried her up the Chesapeake Bay and eventually to Philadelphia. By October 1846, she was in Boston. The city overwhelmed her. More people lived on a single Boston street than in all of Nottoway County. Buildings rose 4 and 5 stories high, their brick facades blackened by coal smoke. Church bells rang constantly, marking hours she'd never learned to count. White people walked past her without a second glance, a miracle she couldn't quite believe. In Virginia, a black woman walking alone would have been stopped, questioned, possibly seized. In Boston, she was simply part of the crowd. She found refuge at Mrs. Abigail Fletcher's boarding house on the north slope of Beacon Hill. Mrs. Fletcher was a widow in her 60s, a committed abolitionist who had turned her home into a sanctuary for escaped slaves. The house, a narrow 3-story brick building with a crooked chimney and windows that rattled in the wind, sheltered 7 permanent residents and a rotating cast of recent arrivals. Margaret was given a small room in the attic, a mattress stuffed with straw and a trunk for her possessions. She owned nothing but the clothes she'd arrived in. Mrs. Fletcher found Margaret work as a seamstress. The boarding house operated a small tailoring business on the ground floor, taking in mending and alterations from the wealthier families on the hill. Margaret's fingers hadn't forgotten their skill. She could take in a waistcoat, hem a dress, or repair torn upholstery with stitches so small they were nearly invisible. She worked 12 hours a day, sometimes 14. She was paid 8 cents an hour, a pittance, but more money than she'd ever held in her life. The other residents of the boarding house became her family. There was Solomon, a man in his 50s who'd escaped from Maryland and now worked at the docks. There was Ruth, barely 16, who'd fled South Carolina with scars on her back that she never spoke about. There was Daniel and his wife, Esther, who'd brought their 2 young children north and lived in constant terror that slave catchers would find them. And there was Reverend Joshua Hayes, a free black man born in Massachusetts, who ran the African Methodist Episcopal Church on Cambridge Street and served as an unofficial guardian for the community. Margaret learned quickly that freedom was more complicated than she'd imagined. Yes, Massachusetts had abolished slavery decades ago. Yes, she could walk the streets without papers. But the Fugitive Slave Act of 1793 remained federal law, and slave catchers still operated in Boston, seizing men and women who couldn't prove their free status and dragging them back south. The law was vague, the proof of freedom difficult to establish, and a free black person's word meant nothing in court compared to a white slave catcher's claim. So Mrs. Fletcher and Reverend Hayes had developed a system. They created free papers, documents declaring that a person had been manumitted by their owner or had been born free. The documents were forgeries, of course, carefully crafted to look authentic, complete with fake signatures, county seals, and dates that predated the person's arrival in Boston. The forgeries were expensive. They required a skilled hand, access to quality paper and official-looking stamps, and the complicity of clerks who could backdate registry entries if questions arose. But they were worth it. With free papers, a person had legal protection, however fragile. Margaret received her papers in December 1846. They declared that she was Margaret Thornhill, a free woman of color born in Alexandria, Virginia, and manumitted by her owner, one Thomas Thornhill, in 1844. The papers cost 6 months of her wages paid in advance. She kept them folded in a small cloth pouch that she wore around her neck, even while sleeping. For 7 months, Margaret lived in a strange state between terror and hope. She woke every morning surprised to find herself still free. She walked to market with Ruth and found herself flinching whenever a white man approached. She learned to speak more openly in the safety of the boarding house, though her voice remained quiet, hesitant. She attended Reverend Hayes's church and heard sermons about dignity and resistance that made her weep. She wrote letters to Peter, not knowing where he was or if he was even alive, and left them unsealed on her small desk, prayers thrown into the void. Boston's abolitionist community was fractured and complicated. Some, like Mrs. Fletcher and Reverend Hayes, believed in direct action, hiding fugitives, creating false papers, openly defying the slave catchers. Others preferred legal challenges and moral persuasion, working through the courts and the press. The tension between these groups was constant. And beneath it all ran a deeper current of fear, because Boston was not as safe as it pretended to be. The city's wealthy merchants depended on Southern cotton for their textile mills. The city's politicians knew that antagonizing the South too openly could have economic consequences. So the abolitionists operated in a gray zone, tolerated but not protected, noticed but not officially acknowledged. Margaret understood, in a way she couldn't articulate, that her freedom was provisional. It existed only as long as no one with power decided to challenge it. In the spring of 1847, Mrs. Fletcher began to grow nervous. She'd heard rumors, whispers from other safe houses, warnings from sympathetic clerks in the courthouse that someone was investigating the forgery network. A lawyer from Virginia had been making inquiries, visiting registries, comparing signatures. He was subtle but persistent. His name was Edward Crane. Mrs. Fletcher called a meeting in late May. Solomon, Ruth, Daniel, Esther, Margaret, and Reverend Hayes gathered in the boarding house parlor after dark, curtains drawn. Mrs. Fletcher stood by the fireplace, her hands twisted together, her normally steady voice tight with worry. "There's a man," she said, "from Richmond. He's asking questions about free papers issued in the last 2 years. He's claiming that some of the manumission documents are forgeries, that the signatures don't match registry records. He's got connections. I don't know how high up they go, but high enough that clerks are cooperating with him." "What does he want?" Solomon asked. "I don't know," Mrs. Fletcher admitted. "If he were a simple slave catcher, he'd be seizing people on the street. But he's not doing that. He's building a case, documenting discrepancies. It's almost like... She paused, choosing her words carefully. It's almost like he's looking for evidence of something bigger than individual fugitives. Reverend Hayes leaned forward, his dark eyes sharp. You think he's after the network itself? I think, Mrs. Fletcher said slowly, that someone wants to shut down our entire operation. And if they succeed, every person we've helped, every set of papers we've created, will be invalidated, which means dozens of people could be seized and sent back south. Margaret felt her chest tighten. She reached instinctively for the pouch around her neck, feeling the shape of her papers through the cloth. If those papers were declared false, she would become Sarah again. Property, not a person. Subject to seizure, to return, to punishment for running. What do we do? Daniel's voice was barely a whisper. We're careful, Mrs. Fletcher said. We don't create any new papers until we know more. We keep our heads down. And if this Crane comes around asking questions, we tell him nothing. Do you understand? Nothing. Everyone nodded. But Margaret saw the fear in their eyes, and she knew her own face reflected it back. They had built something fragile and precious here, a semblance of freedom, and now it was under threat. Edward Crane arrived in Boston in early September 1847. The afternoon of September 12th was unseasonably warm, the air heavy with moisture that promised rain but never delivered. Margaret was working in the ground floor shop, mending a coat for one of Mrs. Fletcher's regular customers when the bell above the door chimed. She looked up and saw a man she didn't recognize stepping inside. He was tall, perhaps 40 years old, with graying hair at his temples and the kind of face that revealed nothing. No warmth, no cruelty, just a professional blankness. He wore a well-tailored black suit, slightly dusty from travel, and carried a leather document case under one arm. His eyes swept the room with the practiced efficiency of someone accustomed to gathering information quickly. Margaret's hands froze mid-stitch. Something about him sent a bolt of primal fear through her body. She recognized the look in his eyes. She'd seen it before, in Virginia, in the faces of overseers and traders. Men who saw black people not as humans, but as problems to be solved, assets to be appraised, or threats to be neutralized. Good afternoon, the man said. His voice was smooth, educated, with the slight drawl of the Virginia tidewater. I'm looking for Mrs. Abigail Fletcher. I was told she runs this establishment. Mrs. Fletcher emerged from the back room, wiping her hands on her apron. I'm Mrs. Fletcher. How can I help you? My name is Edward Crane, the man said, offering a slight bow. I'm an attorney from Richmond. I'm in Boston on business related to property disputes, and I was hoping you might assist me with some inquiries. What sort of inquiries? Mrs. Fletcher's voice was polite but guarded. I'm investigating the validity of certain manumission documents that have surfaced in Virginia over the past several years, Crane said. Documents allegedly proving that individuals claimed as fugitive slaves were, in fact, legally freed by their owners before departing the South. I've reason to believe some of these documents may be fraudulent, and I'm attempting to trace their origin. Margaret's heart was hammering so hard she thought it might burst through her chest. She kept her eyes on her sewing, but her hands were trembling. She could feel Crane's gaze sweep over her, a quick, appraising glance before returning to Mrs. Fletcher. I'm afraid I can't help you, Mrs. Fletcher said evenly. I run a boarding house and a seamstress shop. I don't involve myself in legal matters. Of course, Crane said, his tone suggesting he didn't believe her for a second. But perhaps you're aware that several residents of this establishment possess manumission documents. I'm simply trying to verify their authenticity. I'm sure you can understand, the issue of forged free papers is a serious matter. It undermines the legal rights of property owners and creates chaos in the registry systems of multiple states. If you have specific legal complaints, Mrs. Fletcher said coldly, I suggest you take them up with the proper authorities. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have work to do. Crane smiled, a thin, humorless expression. I appreciate your time, Mrs. Fletcher. I'm staying at the Parker House Hotel, should you think of anything that might be helpful. Good day. He turned to leave, then paused at the door and looked directly at Margaret. And you, miss, what's your name? Margaret's throat closed. Every instinct screamed at her to answer immediately, to show deference, to obey without question. But Mrs. Fletcher stepped forward, positioning herself between Margaret and Crane. The young women in my employ are not obligated to answer questions from strangers, Mrs. Fletcher said firmly. Good day, Mr. Crane. Crane's eyes lingered on Margaret for another long moment, then he nodded slightly and left. The moment the door closed, Margaret's hands began to shake so violently that she dropped her needle. Ruth, who'd been watching from the back room, rushed forward and put a hand on Margaret's shoulder. Mrs. Fletcher locked the door and pulled the curtains closed. "He knows," Margaret whispered. "He knows about the papers." "He suspects," Mrs. Fletcher corrected. "But suspicion isn't proof. Still, this is worse than I thought. He's not just investigating, he's hunting." That evening, Reverend Hayes came to the boarding house and met with Mrs. Fletcher in private. Margaret sat upstairs in her attic room, unable to focus on anything. She kept replaying the moment in her mind, Crane's eyes on her, his question hanging in the air, the way every cell in her body had wanted to submit, to answer, to appease. The fact that she hadn't spoke, that Mrs. Fletcher had intervened, felt both like a victory and a miracle she couldn't quite believe. Around 10 o'clock, Mrs. Fletcher and Reverend Hayes called everyone into the parlor. The Reverend's face was grave. "We've been asking questions about Edward Crane," Hayes said. "He's exactly what he claimed to be, an attorney from Richmond specializing in property law, which in this case means laws pertaining to enslaved people. But here's what he didn't tell you. He's not working alone. He's been hired by a consortium of Virginia planters who believe that the forged document network is costing them thousands of dollars in lost property. They want it shut down, and they want everyone involved prosecuted." "Can they do that?" Daniel asked. "Can they prosecute people in Massachusetts for helping fugitives?" "It's complicated," Hayes said. "Massachusetts has personal liberty laws that make it difficult to enforce the Fugitive Slave Act. But forging legal documents is a crime, even here. And if Crane can prove that prominent Bostonians are involved in the forgery ring, people with money and social standing, he can create enough scandal to shut the whole operation down through public pressure and legal challenges." "So what do we do?" Solomon's voice was rough with anger. "We protect each other," Mrs. Fletcher said. "No one admits to anything. No one shows their papers unless forced to by law. And if Crane comes around again, you don't speak to him. You don't answer his questions. You come find me or Reverend Hayes immediately." Margaret lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling. She could hear rats scratching in the walls, the wind rattling the loose shingles on the roof, the distant sound of a baby crying in one of the neighboring houses. She thought about Peter, wondered where he was, whether he was alive. She thought about the Hartwick plantation, the way Isaac Hartwick had looked at her sometimes, like she was a piece of furniture he might rearrange or discard at will. She thought about the moment in the shop that afternoon when every instinct had screamed at her to obey, to submit, to make herself small and invisible. And she thought about Mrs. Fletcher stepping between her and Crane, creating a barrier with her own body, her own voice. A white woman asserting that Margaret had the right not to answer. It was such a small thing, but it felt enormous, a crack in the wall of absolute submission she'd lived behind for 23 years. Over the next 2 days, Edward Crane was everywhere. He visited the courthouse, examining manumission records. He spoke with clerks at City Hall, comparing signatures and dates. He attended a meeting of the Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society and sat in the back, taking notes. He was spotted on Cambridge Street, near Reverend Hayes's church. He ate dinner at the Parker House and engaged other guests in conversation about the fugitive problem. He was methodical, patient, and relentless. On September 14th, he returned to Mrs. Fletcher's boarding house. It was early evening. Margaret was upstairs in her room, working on a dress alteration by lamplight. She heard the knock at the door, heard Mrs. Fletcher answer it, heard the low murmur of voices. Then she heard footsteps on the stairs. Heavy, deliberate. Mrs. Fletcher appeared in Margaret's doorway, her face pale. "Mr. Crane is here. He's insisting on speaking with you specifically. He says he has questions about your manumission papers." Margaret felt her stomach drop. "I don't have to talk to him." "No," Mrs. Fletcher agreed. "You don't. But he's threatened to file a formal complaint with the city marshal, claiming that I'm harboring fugitive slaves with fraudulent documentation. If he does that, there will be an official investigation, and—" She trailed off, but Margaret understood. An investigation would expose the entire network. Dozens of people would be at risk. "What do I do?" Mrs. Fletcher hesitated, then said quietly, "I'll be with you. Reverend Hayes is on his way. But Margaret, be careful what you say. Don't volunteer any information. And if he asks to see your papers, tell him you need to consult with legal counsel first. Margaret followed Mrs. Fletcher downstairs, her legs feeling like water. Edward Crane was standing in the parlor, silhouetted against the window. He turned as she entered, and his expression was unreadable. "Miss Thornhill," he said, his tone almost cordial. "Thank you for speaking with me. I'll make this brief. I've been reviewing manumission records from Alexandria, Virginia, and I've found some irregularities. Your papers claim you were freed by Thomas Thornhill in 1844, but I can find no record of any Thomas Thornhill owning property in Alexandria during that period. In fact, I can find no record of anyone named Thomas Thornhill in the county registry at all." Margaret said nothing. Her mouth was dry, her pulse racing. She could feel the weight of her papers against her chest, suddenly feeling less like protection and more like evidence of a crime. "Now," Crane continued, "it's possible there's a simple explanation. Record-keeping in Virginia isn't perfect. Perhaps Mr. Thornhill lived in a neighboring county, or perhaps the documents were filed in the wrong location. But I need to verify these details, and to do that I'll need to examine your papers directly. Would you be willing to provide them for inspection?" Mrs. Fletcher stepped forward. "Mr. Crane, as I've already told you—" "I'm not asking you, Mrs. Fletcher," Crane said, his voice hardening slightly. "I'm asking Miss Thornhill. It's a simple question. Will you provide your manumission papers for verification, or won't you?" This was it. The moment crystallized with terrible clarity. If Margaret handed over her papers, Crane would prove they were forged. She would be declared a fugitive, subject to seizure, and returned to Virginia. But if she refused, Crane would take that refusal as proof of guilt and escalate his investigation, endangering everyone in the network. Margaret looked at Crane's face, at the cold certainty in his eyes, the way he stood with his hands clasped behind his back, radiating authority and expectation. Every fiber of her being, every lesson learned over 23 years of survival, screamed at her to comply, to hand over the papers, to lower her eyes and submit. And then, from somewhere deep inside, a different voice spoke. A voice that remembered Mrs. Fletcher stepping between her and danger. A voice that remembered Reverend Hayes's sermons about dignity. A voice that whispered, "You are not in Virginia anymore." Margaret raised her chin and met Edward Crane's eyes directly, something she had never in her entire life done with a white man who held power over her. "No," she said. Her voice shook, but it was clear. "I will not." The room went utterly silent. Mrs. Fletcher's eyes widened. Crane's expression shifted, surprise flickering across his face before settling into cold anger. "I beg your pardon?" His voice was dangerously quiet. "I said no." Margaret's heart was pounding so hard she thought she might faint, but she kept her eyes locked on his. "I don't have to show you anything. This is Massachusetts. I'm a free woman, and you got no authority over me here." For a long, terrible moment, Crane simply stared at her. Margaret saw the calculation in his eyes. He was weighing his options, deciding how to respond to something he clearly hadn't anticipated. A black woman, a former slave, refusing a direct order from a white man. It was unprecedented. It was revolutionary. It was dangerous. Just when we thought we understood the risks Margaret was taking, Edward Crane's next words revealed that this confrontation was about something far more dangerous than forged papers. If you're as gripped by this story as I am, hit that like button to help more people discover these hidden moments of resistance in American history. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss another story like this one. Now let's see what Crane revealed next, because what Margaret didn't know was that her refusal had just made her the key to unraveling a conspiracy that reached far beyond Boston. Crane's expression shifted, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a new edge. Not anger, but something colder. Calculation. "Very well, Miss Thornhill," he said slowly. "You've made your position clear, but let me make mine equally clear. I am not simply investigating forged papers. I am investigating a criminal conspiracy involving the falsification of legal documents, the deliberate corruption of public registries, and the participation of individuals in positions of trust, clerks, notaries, possibly even judges. This network has been operating for years, and it has defrauded legitimate property owners of tens of thousands of dollars." He began to pace, his hands still clasped behind his back. "I already have evidence. I have testimony from witnesses who can connect this boarding house to the forgery operation. I have samples of forged documents, and I have handwriting experts who can prove they were created by the same individual. What I don't have, yet, is proof of who's funding this operation, because someone is paying for quality paper, official stamps, bribed clerks. Someone with money and influence is backing this network. He stopped pacing and looked directly at Mrs. Fletcher. And I believe you know who that someone is. Mrs. Fletcher's face remained carefully neutral, but Margaret saw her hands tighten on the back of a chair. I don't know what you're talking about. I think you do, Crane said. And here's what troubles me, Mrs. Fletcher. I'm a reasonable man. I understand that there are differing views on the institution of slavery, and I'm not interested in dragging every fugitive back south. That would be impractical and frankly unprofitable. What I am interested in is the conspiracy, because if I can prove that wealthy, prominent Bostonians are involved in criminal activity, that's a scandal. That's a story the newspapers will devour. That's leverage. Leverage for what? Reverend Hayes had arrived silently and now stood in the doorway, his tall frame blocking the entrance. Crane turned to face him, unsurprised. Reverend Hayes, I was wondering when you'd join us. To answer your question, leverage for negotiation. The Virginia planters who hired me don't actually want a public trial. Trials are expensive, unpredictable, and they attract attention from radical abolitionists who make everyone's lives more difficult. What they want is for this forgery network to stop operating, and they're willing to make certain concessions, if that happens quietly. What kind of concessions? Hayes's voice was carefully controlled. The kind where nobody gets prosecuted, Crane said. The kind where the people currently in possession of forged papers get to keep them with no questions asked. The kind where everyone walks away from this with their freedom intact, as long as the network shuts down and the names of the people funding it are provided to me confidentially. Margaret felt sick. This wasn't just about her papers or Mrs. Fletcher's boarding house. Crane was trying to dismantle the entire Underground Railroad network by forcing them to betray their own supporters. You're asking us to become informants, Hayes said flatly. I'm offering you a way out, Crane corrected, because the alternative is that I take what evidence I have to the city marshal tomorrow morning and we do this the hard way. Arrests, trials, publicity. And I promise you, Reverend, once the newspapers get hold of this story, the public outcry will make it impossible for anyone to protect you. Boston's merchants depend on Southern cotton. The city's politicians know they can't afford to antagonize the South too openly. If this becomes a scandal, you'll find that your support evaporates very quickly. He let that sink in, then continued. But it doesn't have to be that way. Give me the names. Tell me who's been funding the operation, and I'll go back to Richmond and tell my clients that the network has been neutralized. Everyone wins. Except the people who helped us, Mrs. Fletcher said quietly. The people who risked their own safety and reputations to do what they believed was right. You're asking us to destroy them. I'm asking you to make a choice, Crane said. Protect a handful of wealthy benefactors, or protect dozens of fugitives currently living free in Boston. You can't have both. I'll give you until tomorrow evening to decide. After that, I go to the authorities with what I have. He picked up his hat from the side table and moved toward the door, then paused and looked back at Margaret. You surprised me this evening, Miss Thornhill. I genuinely didn't expect you to refuse. It was brave. Foolish, but brave. I hope for your sake that your allies here are willing to make the practical choice, because if they don't, that courage of yours won't mean much when you're on a ship back to Virginia. He left. The door closed behind him with a soft click that sounded like a gunshot in the silent room. The next hours were the longest of Margaret's life. Mrs. Fletcher, Reverend Hayes, and two other prominent abolitionists, a lawyer named Samuel Hutchinson and a wealthy merchant named Thomas Wainwright, gathered in the boarding house parlor and argued in tense, hushed voices while Margaret and the other residents waited upstairs. Margaret sat on her bed, unable to move, unable to think clearly. Ruth sat beside her, holding her hand. From downstairs they could hear the rise and fall of voices, Hayes's deep baritone, Mrs. Fletcher's sharp protests, the measured tones of the lawyer. They're deciding our fate, Ruth whispered, like we're property again, just in a different way. Margaret understood what she meant. For all the talk of freedom and dignity, in this moment they were back to being problems for other people to solve, assets to be protected or sacrificed, depending on which choice seemed most expedient. Around midnight, Reverend Hayes came upstairs. His face was haggard, his eyes red-rimmed with exhaustion. He sat down heavily on the chair by Margaret's small desk. We've made a decision, he said quietly. "We're not giving Crane the names he wants. We can't betray the people who've helped us. It would destroy the entire network, not just here, but in Philadelphia, New York, everywhere. If we give him those names, he'll use them as leverage against other operations, and the whole system collapses." "So what happens to us?" Margaret asked. Her voice sounded distant to her own ears. "Samuel Hutchinson is going to file an injunction first thing tomorrow morning, arguing that Crane has no legal standing to examine your papers without a warrant, and that the city has no obligation to assist Virginia in enforcing its slave laws. It's not a strong argument, but it'll buy us time. Meanwhile, Thomas Wainwright is contacting his allies in the state legislature to see if we can get political pressure applied, maybe convince the city marshal to drag his feet on any investigation." "But that doesn't solve the problem," Ruth said. "Crane's still here. He's still got evidence." "No," Hayes admitted. "It doesn't solve it. Which is why we're also making preparations to move people if necessary. We have contacts in Canada, in upstate New York. If things go badly, we can get you out." "I don't want to run again," Margaret said quietly. The words surprised her. She hadn't realized she was going to say them until they were out. "I just got here. I just started to feel like maybe I could have a life. And now you're telling me I have to run again, hide again, because some man from Virginia decided I don't have the right to be free?" Hayes leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his large hands clasped together. I know it's not fair. I know you shouldn't have to run. But Margaret, you have to understand something. What you did tonight, refusing Crane, looking him in the eye, that was important. That was powerful. But it was also dangerous, because men like Crane don't forget being defied, especially not by someone they consider beneath them. He's going to come after you specifically now. You've become a symbol to him, a challenge to his authority. So I should have just given him the papers? Let him send me back? No, Hayes said firmly. You did the right thing. But doing the right thing doesn't always keep you safe. That's the tragedy of the world we live in. He stood up, moved to the small window, and looked out at the dark street below. There's something else you need to know. Thomas Wainwright told us something tonight that changes the situation. He's been asking around about Crane, making discreet inquiries among his business contacts. And he found out that Crane isn't just working for Virginia planters. He's also working for someone here in Boston. Margaret felt her stomach drop. Who? We don't know yet, but someone with influence wanted this investigation to happen. Someone who stands to benefit from shutting down the abolitionist network. Wainwright thinks it might be connected to the textile mills. There are mill owners who are worried that anti-slavery agitation will disrupt their cotton supply from the South. They want the abolitionists kept in check, and destroying the Underground Railroad network would be one way to do that. So we're fighting people here too, Ruth said softly, not just Crane. Yes, Hayes said, which means we have to be very, very careful about who we trust. The next morning, September 15th, Samuel Hutchinson filed his injunction in the Massachusetts Superior Court. By noon, word had spread through the abolitionist community, and a small crowd had gathered outside the courthouse, supporters wanting to show solidarity, curiosity seekers hoping for drama, and a few hostile observers who made it clear they thought fugitive slaves should be returned to their rightful owners. Margaret stayed at the boarding house, afraid to go outside. Mrs. Fletcher kept the shop closed, the doors locked, the curtains drawn. They waited. At 3 o'clock, a messenger arrived with news. The judge had denied the injunction, stating that while Massachusetts had no obligation to assist in the capture of fugitive slaves, Crane's investigation into document forgery was a legitimate legal inquiry. Crane was authorized to request an examination of questionable manumission papers, and if the individuals in question refused to cooperate, he could seek a warrant for their arrest on charges of possessing forged documents. "How long do we have?" Mrs. Fletcher asked the messenger, a young clerk from Hutchinson's office. "Crane's already at the marshal's office requesting warrants," the clerk said. "Mr. Hutchinson thinks they'll be issued by tomorrow morning at the latest." After the messenger left, Mrs. Fletcher gathered everyone in the parlor. Her face was pale but composed. "We're out of time," she said. "If those warrants are issued, anyone with questionable papers will be arrested. The marshals will search this house. They'll find our supplies, the blank documents, the stamps, everything, and they'll use that as evidence to prosecute not just me, but everyone who's helped us. We need to destroy the evidence," Solomon said. "That won't be enough," Reverend Hayes said. "Once they arrest someone and examine their papers, they'll be able to prove the forgery. The handwriting, the inconsistencies in the records, Crane already has that evidence. So what do we do? Daniel's voice was tight with fear. Just wait for them to come. There was a long silence. Then Margaret spoke, her voice quiet but clear. I'll go talk to him. Everyone turned to look at her. Margaret, no. Mrs. Fletcher started. He wants the names, right? Margaret said. He wants to know who's funding the network. Well, I'll tell him I'll give him the names if he drops the investigation and leaves everyone else alone. You don't know the names, Hayes pointed out. He doesn't know that, Margaret said. And even if he suspects I'm lying, it'll buy time, maybe enough time for Mr. Hutchinson to figure something out, or for Mr. Wainwright's political contacts to come through. And when Crane realizes you don't actually have information, Mrs. Fletcher said, what happens then? Margaret met her eyes. Then I guess we'll be in the same place we are now, but at least I'll have tried. Ruth grabbed Margaret's hand. Don't do this. You said yourself you didn't want to make yourself small anymore. This is just another way of submitting, offering yourself up to protect the rest of us. It's not the same, Margaret said, though she wasn't entirely sure if that was true. When I refused to show him my papers, that was about not letting him take my dignity. This is about choosing what to do with the little bit of power I have. That's not submission. That's strategy. Hayes studied her for a long moment. You're serious about this? Yes. He exchanged glances with Mrs. Fletcher, who looked torn. Finally, he nodded slowly. All right, but we do this carefully. I'll go with you. We'll meet Crane in a public place. The hotel dining room somewhere with witnesses, and you don't actually give him any information. You just negotiate. Buy time. That evening, Margaret and Reverend Hayes walked to the Parker House Hotel. The sky was overcast, threatening rain. Beacon Hill's gas lamps flickered in the growing darkness, casting long shadows across the cobblestone streets. Margaret wore her best dress, a simple gray cotton gown that Mrs. Fletcher had helped her alter months ago. Her papers were still in the pouch around her neck, a weight she'd grown so accustomed to she barely noticed it anymore. The Parker House was one of Boston's finest hotels, a massive building with marble floors and crystal chandeliers. Margaret had never been inside such a place. The doorman gave her and Hayes a suspicious look, but didn't stop them from entering. Hayes asked for Mr. Crane at the front desk, and a bellboy was dispatched to his room. They waited in the lobby. Margaret's hands were shaking, so she clasped them together tightly. Hayes stood beside her, a reassuring presence. Whatever happens, Hayes said quietly, remember that you don't have to be afraid of him. I know that's easy for me to say. I was born free. I've never lived what you lived. But I want you to remember something. You already did the hardest thing. You already said no to him once. Everything after that is just details. Before Margaret could respond, Edward Crane appeared at the top of the grand staircase. He descended slowly, his face unreadable. When he reached them, he gave a slight nod. Miss Thornhill, Reverend Hayes, this is unexpected. Shall we speak somewhere more private? The dining room will do, Hayes said firmly. Somewhere public. Crane smiled slightly. Of course, I understand. Please, this way. He led them to the hotel's dining room, a large space with white tablecloths and waiters in formal attire. At this hour, it was only half full. Crane selected a table near the back, away from other diners but still visible to the room. They sat down. A waiter appeared and Crane ordered coffee. Margaret and Hayes declined. So, Crane said once the waiter had left, to what do I owe the pleasure? Margaret took a breath. I want to make a deal. I'm listening. You said you wanted the names of the people funding the forgery network. I can give them to you. Crane's expression didn't change, but Margaret saw interest flicker in his eyes. Can you now? But I got conditions, Margaret continued. You drop the investigation, you don't request any warrants, you don't seize anybody's papers, and you leave Boston. That's quite a list of conditions, Crane said. What makes you think you're in a position to negotiate? Because if you arrest me and try to prove my papers are forged, it'll take time. You'll have to go through the courts, and Mr. Hutchinson will fight you every step. Could take weeks, maybe months. And in that time, the people you're really after, the ones with money and influence, they'll cover their tracks. They'll destroy evidence. You'll get nothing. But if you give me the names now, Crane said slowly, I can act quickly, before they have time to prepare. Is that your argument? Yes. Crane leaned back in his chair, studying her. The waiter returned with his coffee and he took a sip, considering. It's a clever offer, but I have a few questions. First, how do I know you actually have the information you're claiming? You're a seamstress who's been in Boston less than a year. Why would anyone trust you with the kind of sensitive information I'm looking for? People talk around me, Margaret said, improvising. They think because I'm quiet, I'm not paying attention. But I hear things, names, places, who meets with who. I see. And second question, why should I trust that you'll actually give me real information once I agree to drop the investigation? What's to stop you from giving me false names? You can verify the names before you leave town, Margaret said. Check their connections, their finances. If I'm lying, you'll know quick enough, and you can go back on the deal. Crane nodded slowly. Logical. But here's my problem, Miss Thornhill. Even if I believe you have information, I'm not sure I want to make this deal. You see, my clients in Virginia want this network destroyed, yes, but they also want an example made. They want people to understand that there are consequences for helping fugitive slaves, for forging legal documents, for undermining the institution of slavery. And you've become rather symbolic in that regard. The fugitive who refused to cooperate. The one who dared to defy a white man's direct question. My clients would be very interested in seeing you return to Virginia to face the consequences of your flight. Margaret felt ice in her veins. She'd walked into this meeting hoping to negotiate, but now she realized Crane had already decided her fate. This wasn't a negotiation. It was a game he was playing with her, watching her squirm. Reverend Hayes leaned forward, his voice hard. You lay one hand on her, Crane, and I'll make sure every newspaper in Boston knows about it. The abolitionist press will eat this story alive. You'll have riots outside your hotel. Will I? Crane said mildly. Or will I have the support of Boston's merchants and politicians who are tired of radical abolitionists disrupting commerce and trade? Don't overestimate your support, Reverend. Massachusetts may have abolished slavery, but that doesn't mean its citizens are willing to sacrifice their livelihoods to protect fugitives. He took another sip of coffee. But I'm not unreasonable. I'll make you a counteroffer, Miss Thornhill. You give me the names right now, tonight, and I'll agree not to seek your arrest specifically. I'll focus my investigation on the forgers and funders, not the fugitives. You get to stay free. Your friends in the boarding house get to stay free. Everyone wins, except the people who've been profiting from this criminal conspiracy. Margaret's mind raced. She didn't have any names to give him, but if she admitted that now, he'd know she'd been bluffing, and he'd move forward with the warrants immediately. She needed more time, but she couldn't think of a way to stall that wouldn't sound like exactly what it was. Desperation. Into the silence a new voice spoke. The name you're looking for is mine. Margaret turned in shock. Thomas Wainwright was standing beside their table. The wealthy merchant was in his 50s, with grey hair and the confident bearing of someone accustomed to power. He wore an expensive suit and carried himself with quiet authority. Crane looked up, surprised. Mr. Wainwright, I've heard of you, of course. To what do I owe? I'm the one funding the forgery network, Wainwright said calmly. He pulled out a chair and sat down without waiting for an invitation. I've been providing the money for supplies, bribing clerks, paying for legal counsel when needed. If you want to prosecute someone, prosecute me. Leave Miss Thornhill and the others alone. Crane's eyes narrowed. That's very noble of you, Mr. Wainwright, but I'm not sure I believe you. Why would a respected merchant involve himself in such activities? Because I have a conscience, Wainwright said, and because I can afford to. You're right that many of Boston's merchants depend on Southern cotton, but not all of us. I made my fortune in shipping to Europe and Asia. I don't need the South's business, which means I have the freedom to act according to my principles. Even if I believed you, Crane said, which I'm not sure I do, prosecuting you presents certain complications. You have influence, friends in high places. It would be difficult to make charges stick. Perhaps, Wainwright agreed, but it would also be very public, very messy. The kind of scandal that attracts attention from radical abolitionists, as Reverend Hayes mentioned. The kind of publicity that might make your clients in Virginia uncomfortable. After all, they hired you to shut down the network quietly, didn't they? Not to start a public war between Boston's business community and Virginia's planter class. Crane was silent for a long moment. Margaret could see the calculation in his eyes, weighing risks, considering angles, trying to decide if Wainwright was bluffing or sincere. Finally, Crane said, "What are you proposing?" "I'm proposing that you've succeeded in your mission," Wainwright said. "The network is compromised. We'll shut down the forgery operation. No more false papers, no more bribed clerks. In exchange, you leave town and report to your clients that you've neutralized the threat. No arrests, no trials, no publicity. Everyone walks away quietly. And the fugitives who are already here, the ones with forged papers, they keep them. You've made your point, the network is closed, but the people who are already free remain free. That's the deal. Crane drummed his fingers on the table, thinking. Finally, he said, I need proof that you're actually involved in this network. I'm not accepting your word alone. Wainwright reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded document. He laid it on the table. This is a receipt for payment to a printer in Philadelphia for specialty paper and official-looking stamps. It's dated 6 months ago, and it's signed by me. There are also records of payments I've made to certain clerks in the county registry office. I can provide those if necessary. You'll find that the amounts and dates correspond with the issuance of questionable manumission documents. Crane picked up the receipt, examined it, then folded it and slipped it into his own pocket. Very well. I'll accept your offer, with one condition. I want a written statement from you admitting your involvement, not for public release but as insurance. If I discover that the network continues operating after I leave Boston, I'll use that statement to prosecute you. Agreed? Wainwright hesitated, then nodded. Agreed. Good. I'll have my attorney draft the statement. You'll sign it tomorrow morning, and I'll be on a train back to Richmond by tomorrow afternoon. He stood up, leaving money on the table for the coffee he'd barely touched. He looked at Margaret, and for just a moment, something like grudging respect flickered across his face. You have interesting friends, Miss Thornhill. More loyal than I expected. Treasure that loyalty. It's a rare thing in this world. Then he left. After Crane's departure, the three of them sat in silence for several minutes. Margaret felt like she couldn't breathe properly, like the corset she wasn't even wearing had suddenly tightened around her ribs. Finally, she found her voice. Why did you do that? Why would you give him that statement? Because someone had to, Wainwright said simply. And I'm in a position to take the risk. I have money, lawyers, political connections. If Crane tries to use that statement against me, I can fight back. You couldn't. Mrs. Fletcher couldn't. So I did what needed to be done. But you're destroying the network, Reverend Hayes said quietly. Without the ability to create new papers, we can't help anyone else who comes north. I know, Wainwright said, and for the first time, his composure cracked slightly. I know, but we were already compromised. Crane had enough evidence to shut us down regardless. At least this way, we protect the people who are already here. And perhaps in time, we can rebuild, more carefully with better security. Margaret looked down at her hands. She should have felt relieved. She was safe, at least for now. Crane was leaving. But instead, she felt hollow. Because Wainwright was right, they'd save themselves by sacrificing the future. Every person who might have fled north in the coming months, every family that might have needed those forged papers, they were out of luck now. It's not fair, she said quietly. No, Wainwright agreed. It's not. But fair is a luxury we don't always get to have. They left the hotel together. Outside, the threatened rain had finally begun, a light drizzle that made the cobblestones slick and reflective. Margaret walked between Hayes and Wainwright, their footsteps echoing in the empty streets. When they reached the boarding house, Mrs. Fletcher was waiting anxiously. They told her everything. She listened in silence, her face pale, and when they finished, she sat down heavily in her chair. I knew this day would come eventually, she said. I just hoped it would be later, that we'd have more time. We'll figure something out, Hayes said. This isn't the end. But Margaret heard the uncertainty in his voice, and she knew that maybe it was the end, at least of this version of the network. They'd won a battle, but the war was far from over. That night, Margaret lay awake again, listening to the rain drum against the roof. She thought about Crane's face when he'd asked her to give him her papers and how she'd said no. She thought about the terror and exhilaration of that moment, the feeling of stepping off a cliff without knowing if she'd fall or fly. She thought about Peter, somewhere in the south, and wondered if he was still alive. She thought about all the other people still enslaved, still waiting for a chance to run north, still hoping that someone would help them. And she thought about the look in Crane's eyes when he'd said, You have interesting friends, Miss Thornhill. Treasure that loyalty. She had defied him. She had looked him in the eye and refused. And even though Wainwright had been the one to ultimately negotiate their safety, Margaret knew that her refusal had mattered. It had changed something, not just in her, but in the way the world had unfolded around her. She didn't know if that was enough, but it was something. The next morning, September 16th, Thomas Wainwright went to the Parker House Hotel to sign the statement Crane's attorney had prepared. Reverend Hayes accompanied him, along with Samuel Hutchinson. Margaret stayed at the boarding house, unable to eat, unable to sit still. Mrs. Fletcher tried to keep her occupied with sewing work, but Margaret's hands shook too much to make straight stitches. Around noon, Hayes returned alone. His face was grim. "Where's Mr. Wainwright?" Mrs. Fletcher asked immediately. "He's been arrested," Hayes said. "Crane double-crossed us." The room went silent except for the ticking of the clock on the mantel. "What happened?" Margaret whispered. Hayes sank into a chair, suddenly looking far older than his years. Wainwright signed the statement as agreed. But when he did, 2 city marshals who'd been waiting in the next room came out and placed him under arrest. Crane had obtained a warrant charging him with conspiracy to forge legal documents, bribery of public officials, and aiding fugitive slaves. The statement he signed was used as a confession. "But Crane said," Mrs. Fletcher started. "Crane lied," Hayes said bitterly. "Or more accurately, he told us what we wanted to hear while he maneuvered us into a trap." By getting Wainwright to confess in writing, he secured evidence that would have taken months to gather otherwise. And by arresting Wainwright, he sends a message to other wealthy abolitionists. Your money and influence won't protect you. "What about the rest of us?" Daniel asked from the doorway. He and several other residents had gathered, drawn by the sound of raised voices. "That's the interesting part," Hayes said. "Crane made sure I understood that he's not seeking warrants for anyone else. Not yet. He got what he wanted, a prominent conviction to use as leverage against the abolitionist community. But he also made it clear that if anyone tries to help Wainwright, if anyone continues operating the network, he'll come back and finish the job. So he's using Thomas as a hostage," Mrs. Fletcher said. "Do nothing, and Thomas goes to prison. Try to help him or rebuild the network, and Crane arrests everyone." Exactly. Margaret felt sick. This was her fault. If she hadn't gone to Crane, if she hadn't offered to make a deal, Wainwright wouldn't have felt compelled to intervene. She'd tried to protect everyone, and instead, she'd given Crane exactly the opening he needed. "This is because of me," she said quietly. Hayes looked at her sharply. "No, this is because of Crane. Don't take responsibility for his actions." "But You did what you thought was right," Hayes interrupted, and Thomas Wainwright chose to step forward knowing the risks. He's not a fool. He knew Crane might betray us. He did it anyway because he believed it was worth it. Don't diminish his choice by making it about your guilt. Over the next several days, the reality of their situation became clear. Thomas Wainwright was held in the city jail, denied bail on the grounds that he was a flight risk. His arrest was reported in the newspapers, some sympathetic, many not. The Boston Courier ran an editorial praising the authorities for finally taking action against those who would undermine law and order in the name of misguided sympathy. The Liberator, William Lloyd Garrison's abolitionist newspaper, ran a scathing piece calling Wainwright's arrest a craven attempt to intimidate those who stand for justice. Samuel Hutchinson filed motions challenging the arrest, arguing that Wainwright had been entrapped. But the legal process moved slowly, and in the meantime, Wainwright remained in jail. Edward Crane left Boston on September 18th, exactly as he'd promised. But before he left, he made sure to visit the boarding house one more time. Margaret answered the door. She'd known somehow that he would come. "Miss Thornhill," Crane said. He didn't ask to come in, just stood on the doorstep in the morning light. "I wanted to say goodbye." "You got what you wanted," Margaret said. Her voice was flat, emotionless. "Mr. Wainwright's in jail. The network shut down. Why are you here?" "To tell you something," Crane said. "You were right to refuse me that first night. Not strategically. Strategically, it was a disaster, obviously. But morally, you were right. I've spent 15 years working in property law, returning fugitive slaves to their owners, and I've never once had someone look me in the eye and simply say no. Everyone submits eventually. Everyone compromises. But you didn't. So what?" Margaret's anger flared suddenly, hot and sharp. "You still won. Mr. Wainwright's still in jail. We still can't help anyone else who runs north." "What difference does it make that I said no?" Crane was silent for a moment, then said quietly, "Because I'll remember it. And that means something. even if you can't see how right now." He turned to leave, then paused. "One more thing. You asked me during our negotiation why I was doing this, why I cared so much about a few fugitive slaves and some forged papers. I told you it was about my clients in Virginia, about protecting property rights. That was true, but it wasn't the whole truth." "What's the whole truth?" Margaret asked. "I had a brother," Crane said, not looking at her. "Younger than me. He became involved with the abolitionist movement in Richmond about 10 years ago. He helped slaves escape, hid them in his home, created false papers. Eventually he was caught. He was tried for theft, stealing another man's property and sent to prison. He died there of cholera in 1842. Margaret stared at him. "You're saying you had an abolitionist brother, and that's why you're hunting fugitives?" "I'm saying I watched my brother destroy his life for a cause that couldn't win," Crane said. "I watched him throw away everything, his career, his reputation, his freedom, for people who couldn't even thank him because they had to keep running north to stay free. And I decided that I wouldn't make the same mistake. I decided that the law, however unjust, was the law, and that fighting it only led to ruin. So you became the thing your brother fought against," Margaret said. "Yes," Crane said simply. "I suppose I did." He tipped his hat to her and walked away. Margaret watched him go, feeling a strange, complicated mixture of anger and something else she couldn't quite name. Not sympathy, exactly, but recognition, maybe. An understanding that people made choices, sometimes terrible choices, for reasons that made sense to them even if they destroyed others. She closed the door and leaned against it, tears streaming down her face. Thomas Wainwright's trial took place in November 1847. Despite Samuel Hutchinson's best efforts, the evidence was damning. Wainwright's own signed confession, the receipts, testimony from clerks who'd accepted bribes. He was convicted on all charges and sentenced to 3 years in prison. The abolitionist community was devastated. Some called for protests, for civil disobedience, for a campaign to free Wainwright by any means necessary. But Reverend Hayes counseled caution. "Wainwright told me something before the trial," he said to the gathered community. He said, "Don't turn my conviction into a martyrdom. Don't let them use me as an excuse to crack down harder. Keep your heads down, survive, and rebuild when it's safe." So they did. The boarding house continued to operate, though Mrs. Fletcher no longer took in new fugitives. The ones already there, Margaret, Solomon, Ruth, Daniel, Esther, and a handful of others, stayed and tried to build lives as normal as possible. Margaret continued working as a seamstress. She saved money. She wrote letters to Peter that she never sent because she didn't know where to send them. In the spring of 1848, Margaret did something she hadn't done since arriving in Boston. She went to the public library, a grand building she'd passed many times but never entered, and asked the librarian to help her find the registry of deaths for Virginia. She wanted to know if Peter's name appeared anywhere. The librarian, a kind, older woman, helped her search through volumes of records. They found nothing. No record of Peter's death, which meant either he was still alive or his death had gone unrecorded. Not uncommon for enslaved people. Margaret chose to believe he was alive. She had to. In July 1848, Margaret met a man named James Calloway, a free black carpenter who'd been born in Maine and had come to Boston looking for work. He was quiet, steady, kind. They married in October 1848 in Reverend Hayes's church, with Mrs. Fletcher and Ruth standing witness. Margaret tried to build a life. She tried to forget the fear, the constant looking over her shoulder, the dreams where she was back in Virginia, and Isaac Hartwick was telling her that Peter had been sold, and it was her fault for running. She tried to be happy, but she never forgot September 14th, 1847, the night she looked Edward Crane in the eye and said no. She told the story to her children years later, when they were old enough to understand. She told them that sometimes the most important thing you can do is refuse. Refuse to submit. Refuse to accept that someone else has the right to own you, command you, diminish you, even when refusal is dangerous, even when it costs more than you can afford to pay. Thomas Wainwright served 18 months of his sentence before being pardoned by the governor in 1849, following a lengthy campaign by his supporters. He emerged from prison thinner, grayer, but unbroken. He never publicly expressed regret for his actions. When asked by a reporter from The Liberator if he would do it again, knowing the consequences, he said simply, yes, without hesitation. The forgery network was never rebuilt, at least not in the same form. But other networks emerged, more cautious, more secretive. The Underground Railroad continued operating through different channels, different methods. People kept running north. People kept helping them. Edward Crane returned to Richmond and continued practicing law. He died in 1863, during the Civil War, when Union forces shelled the city. There's no record of whether he ever thought about Margaret Thornhill, about the woman who'd refused him on a September evening in Boston. But Margaret thought about him, occasionally. Not with hatred. She'd learned that hatred was a weight she couldn't afford to carry, but with a kind of cold understanding. He'd been shaped by his grief and his choices, just as she'd been shaped by hers. In 1850, the Fugitive Slave Act was strengthened, making it even more dangerous for escaped slaves in the North. Margaret and James, fearing recapture, made plans to flee to Canada. But before they could leave, Margaret discovered she was pregnant with their first child. They decided to stay. It was a risk, but they'd already taken so many risks. One more seemed almost manageable. Margaret gave birth to a daughter in March 1851. They named her Abigail, after Mrs. Fletcher. The old woman wept when they told her, holding the tiny baby in her weathered hands and whispering prayers of protection over her. Life continued as it always does, even in the shadow of injustice. Margaret raised 3 children. Abigail, followed by a son named Joshua after Reverend Hayes, and another daughter, Ruth, named for Margaret's friend who had become like a sister. James built furniture and took on carpentry jobs throughout Boston. They saved money, bought a small house in the West End, and became part of a growing community of free black families building lives despite the constant threat of slave catchers and the ever-present discrimination. Mrs. Fletcher died in 1856, at the age of 74. She passed quietly in her sleep, surrounded by the people she'd helped save. At her funeral, Reverend Hayes spoke about her legacy, not just the lives she'd directly touched, but the example she'd set. She taught us, he said, that freedom isn't just the absence of chains, it's the daily choice to resist injustice, to protect the vulnerable, to stand between the powerful and the powerless. Margaret stood in the church that day, holding her youngest daughter's hand, and thought about the moment Mrs. Fletcher had stepped between her and Edward Crane. Such a small gesture, such enormous consequences. The Civil War came in 1861, and everything changed. Margaret watched as her son Joshua, barely 18, enlisted in the 54th Massachusetts Infantry Regiment, one of the first official African-American units in the Union Army. She watched him march away in his blue uniform, tall and proud, and felt terror and pride warring in her chest. Joshua survived the war. He came home in 1865 with a scar across his ribs from a Confederate bayonet and stories he rarely told. He'd been at Fort Wagner. He'd seen friends die. But he'd also seen slavery end, seen the Confederacy fall, seen a new world struggling to be born. Margaret lived to see all of it. She lived to see the 13th Amendment abolish slavery throughout the United States. She lived to see the 14th Amendment grant citizenship to formerly enslaved people. She lived to see black men vote in Massachusetts, though the backlash and violence in the South made it clear that legal freedom didn't automatically translate to safety or equality. In 1875, when Margaret was 52 years old, something unexpected happened. A letter arrived at her home, forwarded through several intermediaries. It was from a woman in Louisiana named Catherine, Peter's second wife, married to him after the war ended. Peter had died 2 years earlier, Catherine wrote. He'd been sold to a plantation in Mississippi in 1846, had survived the war, had been freed, and had spent years trying to find information about Margaret. He'd never known she'd made it to Boston. He'd never known she was alive. He'd assumed she'd been caught, returned to Virginia, maybe killed. So he'd eventually remarried, built a new life, though Catherine wrote that he'd spoken of Margaret often, especially near the end. Catherine had found the letter Peter had been carrying when he died. A letter he'd written to Margaret years ago, but never had an address to send it to. She'd tracked down connections through the Freedmen's Bureau, through church networks, through the complicated web of black communities trying to rebuild after the war, and finally found someone who knew where Margaret Thornhill lived in Boston. She enclosed Peter's letter with her own. Margaret opened it with shaking hands. James sat beside her, holding her steady. The letter was brief, the handwriting awkward. Peter had learned to write only after the war ended, taught by a northern schoolteacher in the Freedmen's School. But the words were clear. My Sarah, I do not know if you are alive. I do not know if you will ever read this. But I need to write it, need to say it. Even if these words go nowhere, you were the bravest person I ever knew. When you ran, when you chose freedom even though it meant leaving me behind, I was angry at first. Then I understood. You did what I was too afraid to do. You chose to live instead of just survive. I hope you made it north. I hope you found safety. I hope you built a life. I hope you know that I loved you and that your courage gave me strength to keep going even in the worst times. If you read this, know that you were not forgotten. You mattered. You matter still. Peter. Margaret read the letter 3 times, tears streaming down her face. James held her while she wept, not just for Peter, though the grief for him was real and sharp, but for everything. For the years they'd lost, for the life they might have had together if the world had been different, for all the people still struggling, still fighting, still trying to build lives in the ruins of an unjust system. But also, she realized, she was crying with something like relief. Peter had survived. He'd been free. He'd had a life, maybe even some happiness. And he'd thought of her with love, not bitterness. That was something. That was more than she dared hope for. She wrote back to Catherine, thanking her for finding her, for sending the letter. She told her about Boston, about James and the children, about the life she'd built. She told her that Peter had been right. She had found safety, though it was a more complicated and fragile thing than she'd imagined as a young woman running north. The 2 women exchanged several more letters over the following years, and through Catherine, Margaret learned more about Peter's life after enslavement. He'd worked as a farmer, had helped build a church in his community, had been one of the black men who'd voted in Louisiana in the brief window when it was possible. He'd faced violence and intimidation, but had kept going. He'd been, Catherine said, a man of quiet dignity who refused to bow. Margaret recognized that quality. It was what she'd tried to cultivate in herself, that refusal to be diminished. In 1889, Margaret fell ill. The doctors called it pneumonia, though she suspected it was simply that her body, after 66 years of fighting, was tired. She knew she was dying, and she found she wasn't afraid. She'd lived longer than most people who'd been born enslaved. She'd seen her children grow up free. She'd witnessed the end of slavery itself, however imperfectly that freedom had been realized. Her children and grandchildren gathered around her bed. Her daughter Abigail, now a schoolteacher. Her son Joshua working as a carpenter like his father. Her youngest, Ruth, married with children of her own. Her oldest granddaughter, a bright young woman of 16 named Sarah, named after Margaret's birth name, asked her, "Grandmother, what are you most proud of in your life?" Margaret thought for a long moment. She could say her children, and that would be true. She could say surviving, building a life, seeing slavery end, and those would all be true too. But what came to her mind was a September evening in 1847, standing in Mrs. Fletcher's parlor, looking Edward Crane in the eye. "The night I said no," she said quietly. Sarah looked confused. "What do you mean?" So Margaret told her about the boarding house, about Edward Crane, about the moment when every instinct screamed at her to submit, and she'd chosen refusal instead. Told her about the fear and the exhilaration, the consequences and the cost. "That's when I became free," Margaret said. "Not when I crossed into Massachusetts, not when I got my papers. When I looked that man in the eye and told him no, that's when I knew I was a person, not property. Everything else came from that." She died 3 days later, on a cool October morning, with her family around her and sunlight streaming through the window. They buried her in a small cemetery in Cambridge, not far from Reverend Hayes's old church. The headstone read, "Margaret Thornhill Calloway, 1823-1889. She said no. Years later, when historians tried to piece together the story of the Boston forgery network and Edward Crane's investigation, they found fragments, a few letters, some court documents, scattered newspaper articles, but much of the story had been lost, deliberately erased, destroyed in fires, or simply forgotten as people who'd lived through it died and took their memories with them. The boarding house on Beacon Hill still stands, though it's been renovated many times and no longer looks much like it did in 1847. In 1947, on the 100th anniversary of Margaret's confrontation with Crane, a small group of local historians managed to get a plaque installed on the building's front. It reads, "This building served as a safe house on the Underground Railroad from 1842-1847. Here, Men and women who had escaped slavery found refuge, support, and the courage to build new lives. May we never forget their bravery. The plaque doesn't mention Margaret by name. It doesn't mention Mrs. Fletcher or Thomas Wainwright or Reverend Hayes or Edward Crane. It's a generic memorial, the kind that acknowledges history without getting into the messy, complicated, deeply human details. Margaret's granddaughter Sarah, the one who'd asked about her proudest moment, became a teacher and later a writer. She spent years collecting oral histories from formerly enslaved people and their descendants, trying to preserve stories that official records had ignored or distorted. She wrote down her grandmother's story in detail: the fear, the defiance, the cost of resistance, the complicated morality of people trying to do good in an unjust system. Her manuscript was never published during her lifetime. Publishers told her it was too specific, too focused on one woman's experience, not dramatic enough. They wanted either sanitized inspiration or sensational horror, not the complicated truth of how people actually survived and resisted. The manuscript ended up in a university archive in the 1930s, catalogued but largely unread. Historians mining the archive for dissertations occasionally stumbled across it, noted a few details, moved on to sources they considered more reliable or significant. But Sarah had written it. The story existed, and even if it wasn't famous, even if it didn't change the world, it was there. A testament to the fact that Margaret Thornhill had lived, had resisted, had mattered. And maybe that's enough. Maybe that's all any of us get. To live as fully as we can, to resist injustice where we find it, to make small choices that might seem insignificant, but that ripple outward in ways we never fully see. Margaret didn't end slavery. She didn't revolutionize the Underground Railroad. She didn't become famous. She just looked a man in the eye and said no when every part of her had been trained to say yes. And in doing so, she reclaimed something that slavery had tried to take from her: the fundamental right to refuse, to assert her own humanity, to be seen not as property, but as a person with the power to make choices about her own life. That single moment didn't fix everything. Edward Crane still arrested Thomas Wainwright. The network still collapsed. Slavery continued for another 18 years. The struggle for true equality continues to this day. But the moment mattered. It mattered to Margaret. It mattered to the people who witnessed it. It mattered to her children and grandchildren who heard the story and understood that resistance was possible, even when it was dangerous, even when it cost more than you could afford to pay. History is made of millions of small moments like that. Small refusals, small acts of courage, small choices to prioritize dignity over safety. They don't all make it into the textbooks. They don't all get commemorated with statues or holidays, but they accumulate layer upon layer, choice upon choice, person upon person, until gradually, impossibly, the world shifts. Margaret Thornhill never saw herself as a hero. She was just a woman trying to survive, trying to build a life, trying to hold on to her humanity in a system designed to strip it away. But in that September evening in 1847, when she refused to submit, she did something heroic, not in the grand, dramatic sense, but in the quiet, essential sense of asserting that she mattered, that her voice had power, that she was more than what others tried to make her. And that ultimately is the story. Not of villains and heroes, not of simple victories or tragic defeats, but of human beings making choices in impossible circumstances, trying to hold on to dignity and hope, even when the world gives them every reason to surrender both. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed, or do you sense there are layers we'll never fully uncover? Margaret's act of defiance was small in the grand scope of history, but it rippled outward in ways she never fully saw. It reminds us that resistance takes many forms, and sometimes the most profound act is simply refusing to bow. If this story moved you, subscribe to this channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss another hidden tale from American history. Share this with someone who needs to hear about courage in impossible circumstances, and leave your thoughts in the comments below. What would you have done in Margaret's position? Would you have had the strength to say no when everything in your life had taught you to say yes? Thank you for listening. Until next time, remember, every act of resistance, no matter how small, matters. Every voice raised against injustice adds to the chorus. Every person who refuses to be diminished changes the world, even if just a little. Margaret Thornhill understood that. and maybe in remembering her story, we can understand it too.